Hello, welcome to the Theology Podcast. It's really great to have you with us today. Hopefully, we will all remain with you today. We've been having some technical difficulties, and Tom has flashed in and out once. But we're actually, one of the things we did today before we started the show is we talked about getting together again in an actual pub to record live. And we're planning to do that next week. So the technical problems will change. Won't be the same ones, but they'll be there. But anyway, with that out of the way, it's great to have you again here at the Theology Podcast. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm the senior pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Manchester in Manchester, Connecticut. I've written some things, and I'm working on a book right now on Tom Bombadil, and I've got an essay coming out in Plow Magazine that actually gets into some of the themes with regard to the book. So when that's published, I'll be sure to let folks know. But anyway, that's enough about me. So Tom, how about introducing yourself? And then we got Glenn, and then Glenn can introduce us to the subject of the day.
Okay. I'm Tom Price, a systematic theologian, Christian ethicist, teaching both at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
And I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor of early modern European history at Central Connecticut State University and a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I also have a book that I am just finishing up. It is, well, the working title was Taming Leviathan, and then I've since found out that that's the title of another book. So I'm thinking of changing it to Slaying Leviathan.
All right.
It's about Protestant resistance theory, human rights, limited government, all kinds of things. So I should have that done. I'm hoping by the time we record again, that will be finished.
Nice.
And it's off to Canon Press for editing and publication.
Nice.
Well, that's great. Speaking of Canon Press, that'll really follow on very nicely to your introduction to Windicea contra Theranos, which has really been flying off the shelves, according to the folks at Canon.
Well, that's good news.
Yeah. So Glenn wrote the introduction. I may have said that, maybe repeating myself. I wanted to make sure that that was clear. The actual book is something that was written in the 16th century following the St. Bartholomew's Day massacres, and written anonymously under the pseudonym Junius Brutus. And Glenn gets into the speculation regarding who actually wrote it in the introduction. But I'm about a quarter of the way through it. I'm really enjoying it. And we are having a book discussion here in Eastern Connecticut. It will be in person, and I've got probably about 8 maybe people signed up already for that. And Glenn has promised to actually come to our first meeting to discuss the introduction. So if you're interested in being a part of this group, just let me know. I actually had someone who really went to work and track me down to let me know by going to my website, crwiley.com, and sent me a note and expressed interest in being in the group. This, by the way, is a book. The translation of the title is A Defense of Liberty Against Tyrants, which is very timely, very timely. Anyway, Glenn, why don't we get into the show? And I've got a few announcements at the end that we can get to, but why don't we jump into the topic?
Okay, the topic was actually inspired by Chris's last trip to Moscow.
Moscow, Idaho.
Moscow, Idaho, yes.
You weren't meeting with the Metropolitan then that day.
Or with Putin. Yeah, so it turns out, and Chris, you can tell us more about this, but it turns out that there are a lot of people who are showing up out there in Moscow, Idaho, who are functionally religious refugees.
Right.
Who are experiencing things in other parts of the country that, frankly, they can't live with. That are violations of their principles, that are violations of their conscience. And they're going out there because they think that this is a place where they won't be pressured into the kinds of nonsense that has been happening where they are. So that brings up this entire idea of religious refugees. And as a Reformation historian, and specifically a Reformation historian focused in the Reformed tradition. This is something that is frankly, a major theme of the 16th century. As a matter of fact, Heiko Obermann, who is one of the great historians of the Reformation of the 20th century, toward the end of his life was beginning to argue that we need to talk about, I forgot what number it was, something like a third Reformation, which for him was a Reformation of the refugees, because the experience of being a refugee was so central to so many key figures in the among the second generation reformers. Calvin was a religious refugee. Calvin left France in a period in which the story here is kind of long and complicated, but bottom line is that the King of France had decided that he needed to exterminate Protestantism in the country. And so they were burning Protestants alive over slow fires in public squares in France. Calvin was implicated. I don't think he was at the time, but he was, a warrant for his arrest on suspicion of being a Protestant was issued.
Wow.
And Calvin ended up deciding it would be considerably healthier for him to be somewhere else.
Right.
So he left. And personally, I can't prove this, but personally, I think the thing that triggered this was a speech given by one of Calvin's friends, who it was suspected that Calvin Ghost wrote it. But the speech was really basically an Erasmian style interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount. Catholic humanism, really, but a reform-minded view of Catholicism in the period. And the problem is it talked about a contrast between the new religion and the old religion. And in the context of the era, the year in which that was written, the authorities thought he meant Protestantism versus Catholicism. Personally, I think it was their reaction to Kopp's speech, Nicholas Kopp is the guy who actually did the speech, that drove Calvin to Protestantism. I think he said the Catholic Church needs reform. And if such a mild program as this is going to generate this kind of opposition, there's no hope for it at all. And I think that's the thing that basically shocked him into his Protestant convictions.
Isn't that interesting? So he was charged with Protestantism, but was actually not guilty at the moment, and then became guilty.
Right. Largely because of the charge, I suspect.
Right, right.
But in any event, Calvin travels. He never actually studied theology formally. He's entirely self-taught.
Okay.
Settles in Basel, which is a major publishing center, publishes the Institutes in 1536, first edition. It hits like a bombshell in the Protestant world. Arguably, it's the first Protestant systematic theology.
Got you.
And he suddenly became a household name. This unknown Frenchman suddenly becomes a major figure within Protestantism. He traveled from there. He wanted to go to Strasbourg, but he had a bit of a detour because of a war. He couldn't quite get there. And so he ended up in Geneva, where he was recruited by a rather fiery reformer by the name of Guillaume Farel. Guillaume is French for William, so you can call him Will Farrell if you really want. But Farel was, again, the story with Geneva is complicated. Long story short, it had been run by a bishop. They kicked the bishop out with the support of the Protestant cantons, who then said, we'll help you if you'll go Protestant. So earlier that year in 1536, they booted out the bishop, and the Protestant canton of Bern sent Farel and some other people in to Protestantize Geneva, and that's just about the point when Calvin arrived.
Interesting.
So he was pressured into staying there, basically. He didn't want to, but he was pressured into staying.
Right. So many things when we talk about history, because it's stuff that actually happened, or, have these intriguing plot turns and unexpected, sort of confluence of things that come together. And what fascinated me about your description of Calvin's conversion, though, is that it defies the kind of church growth logic that's promoted today. And the church growth logic that's promoted today is we got to make sure that no one has to pay much of a price to be a Christian. Right?
Yeah.
In other words, so we got to lower the bar of entry as far as we can get it down so we can get more and more people in. Here's a situation. We're not talking about a conversion from paganism to Christianity. We're talking about a conversion to Protestantism. But nevertheless, here's a guy who's accused of being a Protestant, but wasn't, but was so kind of put out by how it was done and what it revealed about the kind of the bankruptcy, the moral bankruptcy of the church he had belonged to, that he converts. Just a fascinating thing.
Yeah. Well, Calvin had a falling out. Calvin and Farel had a falling out with the Genevan government. So Calvin where he wanted to be anyway.
Where did he go? You kind of cut out there a second.
Oh, he ended up in Strasbourg.
Yeah.
Is where he wanted to go in the first place, because that was a major center of French refugees. French Protestants fleeing persecution went to Strasbourg because Strasbourg was, at this point, not in France. It was in the Holy Roman Empire, and it was a Protestant city. So the major Protestant refugee church in the 1530s is located in Strasbourg. So Calvin goes there. The reformer of Strasbourg, Martin Bucer, takes him under his wing. Calvin actually is finally ordained as a pastor. He was only a teacher in Geneva under the first stint. And I think this was really, frankly, the happiest period of Calvin's life, the few years he spent in Strasbourg. Working with Bucer, working with the French church there. He got married, actually to a widow of an Anabaptist. Kind of interesting story there. But there were problems in Geneva. It turns out a Catholic cardinal had written a letter to the city appealing them to return to Rome. And it was written with all the rhetorical style a good, highly trained humanist could do. And the town council panicked. They thought that there was a real danger that Geneva would revert to Catholicism. And if that happened, frankly, the town council would all be executed as traitors.
That'll get your attention.
Yeah. So they appealed to some people to write a response, and the answer was invariably, I'm not equipped to do this. I can't really do this. Somebody said, I can't do this, but I know who can. Send it to Calvin. And the town council was kind of reluctant to do this, but they sent it to Calvin. Calvin doesn't really want to give him the time of day, but the fact is he also doesn't want the city to revert to Catholicism. So he wrote a response to Sadoletto's letter that to say he refuted Sadoletto is sort of like saying we dropped a firecracker on Hiroshima. He completely demolished Sadoletto so badly that literally from that time till today, Geneva has not thought about going back to Catholicism. The town council contacted Calvin and said, all's forgiven, John, come back. John replied, not on your life. At Verret, one of Calvin's friends there told, look, ask him what it would take for him to come. So they sent Calvin a letter saying, all right, what would it take to get you to agree to come back and lead the church here? Calvin thought about it and he said, all right, they want an answer, I'll give them an answer. I want a large house near St. Peter's, which is where I want to be assigned to preach. I want X amount for my salary. By the way, his salary request included approximately 500 liters of wine annually.
Good for him.
He was French.
He knew it too. He knew
it. Being fair, it was not just for him, it was for his household.
Sure.
But the really curious thing about that is that the unit of measure that they used for wine, which is a little less than 500 liters, is called a butt. So Calvin actually asked for a buttload of wine as part of his salary. But then Calvin threw in the poison pill. He'd been thrown out of the city over an issue of church governance. And so he put in the poison pill that he knew they would never agree to, which is you also have to give me a free hand at organizing the church government in the city. The response came back, done, when will you arrive?
Right.
And Calvin's reaction was, oh, shoot.
That's right.
I think they would ever go for this. But since they did, Calvin felt obligated to return to Geneva. So he
Well, isn't that
returns.
But isn't that fascinating that we see this again and again in the history of the church? I don't want to be bishop. I don't want to be bishop. And those are the guys that do the best
Ambrose.
job. And Ambrose. Moses didn't want the job. And nobody wants the job. Maybe that's the thing. If you want the job, you shouldn't have the job. If you don't want the job, you're the man for the job.
There's probably a lot of truth to that. Now, what I really like, though, is that Calvin had been lecturing on the Bible before he'd been kicked out the first time. And I don't know what the passage was that he had been studying. But when he got back, he was supposed to be a pastor, but also to continue teaching. So he went to the Bible study, and he said, I don't know what the passage was, but we'll just make one up. He said, okay, when last we met, we were on Ezekiel 17, verse 4. We now pick it up with verse 5. And he continued exactly where he left off without acknowledging the 3-year break. I mean, again, the guy could show real style. So, in any event, Calvin...
he had...
Oh, yeah, go on.
Oh, yeah, well, he had something of that about him. It's similar to his revisions of the Institutes, is that they were pretty much in completed form the first time he did them. I mean, he adds, but even I think, what was he, almost 30 by the time he was very young when the final product ended. Is that correct?
Well, the initial product, he continued revising it throughout his life, all the way up until literally he was on his deathbed. And as a result, it is the final version is 10 times longer than the original version. But what's really interesting is he rearranges some things, but he never actually changes his theology. The theology remains constant through the whole thing, which is really remarkable.
I remember David Steinmetz telling me, he said, a lot of people don't realize that the institutes of the Christian religion are really the doctrinal commonplaces of all his commentary work.
Right. Yeah, he describes them as loci communes et disputationes, which translates to commonplaces. In other words, common themes that you will find throughout Scripture, plus disputation. We got into a debate, he put that in there too. So he believed methodologically that when you write a commentary on a book of the Bible, you should focus on the things that are unique and distinctive to that book. If it's a broader theme, it should be somewhere else. It should be in the Institutes. So he develops more and more commonplaces as he's teaching through Scripture. And then in the next edition of the Institutes, he figures out where to put them.
Where to put them, yeah.
That's what he was doing with that. Now, when Calvin arrives in Geneva, there are a couple of things that end up happening. He's pastor, he organizes the church. It sets up actually the system that Presbyterian churches use for local church government to today. He's the guy who really designs that. A few modifications, but one of the other things he begins doing, and this is where we're really getting to our theme, he's a refugee, but he also begins writing theological material, good quality theological treatises in French. Nobody had done that before. And so France...
It was all Latin.
Well, mostly in Latin, or Lutheran German, or something like that. Nobody was doing French. And so in the period of 1520s in France, historian Lucien Febvre described it, and I quote, as a period of magnificent religious anarchy.
Okay.
Protestant movements were going in all kinds of different directions. There was no unifying thread going through any of them. Once Calvin begins writing these things in French, overwhelmingly the French Protestants begin going toward Calvin's theology. Now, there were exceptions, but most of them head in that direction. And what that means is that when religious persecution breaks out in France, the easiest thing to do is to hop across the border to Geneva. And the net result is Geneva starts getting flooded with French religious refugees. Others came across from Italy. We have a significant contingent from England as a result of Bloody Mary's persecution Protestants there, but the majority of them are French.
So we end up with this sort of kind of hodgepodge then of
Right.
people from all over the place, and I imagine that has some very interesting sort of chemistry.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things that happen. One of them, well, first of all, you have to realize that when we think of refugees, we typically think of the poor.
Right.
They're not the ones who are the refugees. The ones who are the refugees are the people who have money and connections and can get out.
Yeah. And by the way, that's kind of what's happening in Moscow right now. What inspired this whole thing, and my suggestion to you for this episode, is a conversation I had with Doug about, the people who are arriving there, and they're professional people, highly educated people who have kind of connected with Moscow through Doug's writing in kind of the way that I think the French were connecting with Calvin through his writing. So another interesting parallel.
Yeah. And, when the persecution, okay, let's add one other thing. Persecution breaks out in England under Mary Tudor, Mary I, the only English monarch with a mixed drink named after her.
who is buried by her sister.
Yes. Well, they end up going to the Rhineland and to the Swiss cantons and to Geneva. Why? All of those areas had Reformed churches. The Lutherans, remember I said last week when we were talking with Touchstone, the Lutherans don't play well with others?
Right.
The Lutherans wouldn't accept anybody in Lutheran territory who couldn't sign on to Luther's exact formula for the Lord's Supper, understanding the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
The Reformed communities were more, and basically no one except the Germans and the Scandinavians could. So Lutheranism doesn't spread initially much beyond Germany and Scandinavia. Okay. But instead, you get the people who are fleeing religious persecution end up in Reformed areas, and especially in Geneva because of Calvin's stature as a theologian. You're also getting them in other places too, because there are other important theologians as well. But the most important concentration ends up in Geneva. And then what Calvin does is he organizes something called the Geneva Academy. It's now known as the University of Geneva, which was founded to train missionary pastors.
Interesting.
Them in place ahead of time, earlier than this. But what they would do is they would remember, these are wealthy, educated people. They all know Latin, so you can teach them. You don't collect them. They would train them to be pastors. They would serve in Geneva. They would be elders. They would get ordained as pastors in Geneva. Then Calvin would send them back to their home countries, where they would then establish Reformed churches. That's why the Dutch end up Reformed. John Knox is there.
Yeah.
He's bringing that back. A whole bunch of other English refugees in Geneva. When Elizabeth comes to the throne and England goes back to Protestantism, they go back and they bring Calvinism with them. Virgin and the Puritans, the Huguenots. You even get pastors from Hungary and Poland. So there's a Hungarian Reformed Church, and for a while an important Polish Reformed Church. Actually, in Belarus, which in this period was part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, part of Poland in essence, the golden age of Belarus, by their own admission, was the period in which it was Calvinist.
Interesting. You're going to say
something? Because the refugees came, he trained them and sent them back.
Right. So, Tom, you're going to say something?
Well, I had a little question here. It's been a long time since I've kind of focused on this stretch of history. But Glenn, I know it was a very complicated set of political circumstances dealing with each of the countries involved. But what were some of the political ramifications of distinctly sort of Calvin's thinking? Because I do know from the work I've done is some were on board for theological reasons, but oftentimes people are attracted for the political implications that came along with this particular strand of the Reformation.
Yeah. To answer that, we have to kind of go into the weeds and deal with polity to some extent.
Okay.
In other words, church organization.
Yeah.
Another part of the answer, sort of the short part of the answer, is that the pastors that Calvin trained were extremely dedicated. They believed this. They accepted it wholeheartedly and implicitly. And, you know, I hate to put it this way, but Calvinist pastors made good martyrs.
Yeah.
Okay.
They went to their deaths willingly for what they believed.
Right. Right. Well, that's something else. That's something else that we ought to reflect on a little bit in the situation we find ourselves in today. I don't think I'm hearing the word martyr used at all anywhere. In other words, it's more or less, we got to figure out a new way to package our message to appeal to this leftward trending culture.
Right.
That seems to me to be what everybody thinks ought to happen. To die for something, you gotta be a principled person.
Yes.
Right? And we just are not creating principled people.
Yeah. And we sort of forget that there's a verse that says something like, friendship with the world is...
Right. Enmity toward God, right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So now the other part of it, the political dynamic, is really kind of complicated here. Calvin himself only organized a church structure on a local level. He never really designed one for an entire country. As a matter of fact, when the King of Poland writes a letter to Calvin and says, how should I organize the church here? Calvin said, yeah, use bishops. Just make sure.
Oh, really?
What we think of as the Presbyterian system actually originated in France. And it originated in France largely because of that period of magnificent religious anarchy, where you have all of these churches that develop that are independent churches. And the question is then, how do you unite them into a single organization when they're used to being independent and they're French? None of them want to submit to anybody else. So what you do is you say that the church can govern its own affairs, matters that are purely of local interest, that's the church's responsibility. But they cannot impinge on any other church. They can't dictate anything to any other church. So anything that affects more than one church has to be settled by a council. And eventually they develop a thing called the colloquy, which is the equivalent of the presbytery, the provincial synod, which is the equivalent of the I think it's just called the synod, and then the national synod, which is the equivalent of the General Assembly. So regional issues at the level of the colloquy, provincial issues at the level of the provincial synod, national issues at the level of the national synod. It's the only way that they could develop a system that would unite them, but that would not allow anybody to have authority over a different church.
Right.
It's not directly.
So
in other words, they develop a republican government.
Right. So this would be the Huguenots we're referring to at this point?
This is the Huguenots. Mm-hmm. And that is, in fact, the short version of my entire doctoral dissertation.
Okay.
So, now here's the trick. Aristotle's politics say there are three basic kinds of government. Good government. You have monarchy, degenerate, it's a tyranny. Aristocracy, in a degenerate form, it's an oligarchy. And republic, government by representation, in its degenerate form, it's democracy. Okay. The problem that comes up in France is that you have a republican church government existing inside a monarchy. And that's always an unstable situation, because if a form of government is good enough for God, it should be good enough for the state.
Right.
So the Huguenots were constantly being accused of being Republicans or anti-monarchialists or whatever, being anti-monarchy. And they kept trying to argue that they weren't, but the church government really suggested that they were. Now, it works much better in the Dutch Republic, because in this period, the Netherlands was a republic. There was no king.
Right.
So you have a republican government that gets adopted very quickly, a republican territory that very quickly adopts republican church government in imitation of the French.
Which is kind of paradoxical.
Yeah. And then in Scotland, they adopt it because the history of Scotland consists of the lords fighting it out to get one person in as king, and then as soon as he was king, they worked to undermine his power. That's the history of Scotland. So they adopt the system in Scotland because the lairds control the presbyteries. And they can then use the church through the presbyteries to counterbalance the power of the monarch.
So let's stop here and just reflect a couple of seconds on our current situation. We've got a situation now where, in the United States, at least ostensibly, we are a constitutional republic. We don't have a king, but we seem to be having a situation in which maybe monarchy is emerging from the grassroots in different places. But what's happened is that our Constitution, the First Amendment, was suspended recently, and no one owned it. No one put it in those terms. It was entirely, a matter of submitting to the experts and the science, as though the science possessed a kind of innate wisdom that would allow us to negotiate the kind of trade-offs that we have to have anytime any policy is implemented. So instead of actually debating any of that and sort of thinking about what's this going to cost us, we just go ahead and do that, whatever the experts say, because we want to hide behind those guys.
And within a cultural situation in which we move towards privileging the science when we want to, and then we completely dismiss it and undermine it when it goes against the grain of other wants and desires that we want that conflicts with the science.
Well, that's exactly right. But I guess the thing that I'd like to just focus in on right at the moment is that we have a lot of people quoting Romans 13, 1 through 7 to me. And it's almost as though the frame of mind that the people who quote that are in is monarchical. They're basically saying, just you're a subject of the government. That's not the government, at least,
right.
Historically.
Yeah, you have to take into account a couple of different things here, it seems to me. One of them is that, the distinction between being a subject and being a citizen. Paul wrote that in a monarchical context, and the question is then, how do you translate that into our setting, which is not a direct one-to-one thing, because we're in a, the rule is that where you have genuinely comparable situations, the scriptural instructions stand as written, but we're not in a genuinely comparable situation. The nature
and further, Paul was a citizen of Rome, and he didn't have any problem challenging the authorities when they were in the wrong, and he could pull out that card. Hey, I'm a citizen, and then they would get scared. It would go from Paul being afraid to they were afraid.
Yeah.
So I guess my point is that we've lost a sense of how governments work and what it means to submit, but also in a Republican, constitutional order, we are we have a voice in our government. Mm-hmm. Every 2 to 4 years, we actually judge our rulers, throw the bums out or whatever. Mm-hmm. But even in between, during those periods of time, people can actually sue the government. Right. So this is the thing that I think John MacArthur should have done. He shouldn't have appealed to freedom of religion. He should have said, you guys violated the Constitution. Mm-hmm. We're going to sue for the reinstatement of the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. How do you like them apples?
Yeah. Now, I think we need to say something about the First Amendment here, because this is really important. People will tell you, particularly on the left, they will tell you that the First Amendment, people only talk about freedom of religion specifically as an excuse for bigotry. That's the rhetoric on the left. Now, the reason why the First Amendment is written the way it is, it starts, the very first thing it says has to do with Congress not establishing a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. What that really is, it's, in context, what it means is Congress doesn't have the right to set up a national church. That's what it's intended to say. But not prohibiting the free exercise is critical to that too. What it is in essence, though, is an argument for freedom of conscience. The government cannot impose on a person's conscience. And this is something that goes back actually to the early church fathers. A lot of them wrote about it. Luther certainly did as well. The idea that your conscience is your own and can only be judged by God. And in fact, if you lose freedom of conscience, none of the other freedoms that we are supposedly protected in the Bill of Rights, none of them matter. If you lose freedom of conscience, freedom of speech doesn't matter. You don't have the right to say things because you don't have the right to believe them.
Yeah, I think that freedom of speech is on obviously it's a target of the left next, but I was thinking in particular freedom of association, because that was really the thing that's the thing that was targeted. Yeah. Now I understand that, there are circumstances in which, allowing people to associate could be disastrous. But I think the burden of proof is got to be very high. I mean, and we've never had in the history of the United States, as far as I know, you're an historian, so correct me if I'm overstating the case. We've had suspension of the First Amendment when it comes to these matters during wartime in regional sort of in regions and places, but never an entire country. Never the entire country from coast to coast.
Yeah, I don't know of any case where there was. Now, it is worth noting that in the Spanish flu pandemic, they did urge people, for example, to wear masks and not meet and things like that. But it was not mandatory. It was largely voluntary. In some cases, I think there were mandatory rules, but overall it was voluntary, and people just said, yeah, okay, this is fine. Spanish flu is killing a lot of people. I think this is a good idea.
Yeah. And I think that, the exercise of judgment, of personal, of independent judgment, is the basis for a democratic order. That's what voting is all about. I mean, so what's been sort of precluded is the freedom to exercise judgment. We're just letting a bunch of other people think for us, and we're just, this gets me back to thinking about Aristotle. I was just reading in the Politics recently. The distinction that Aristotle makes between the constitution, meaning the sort of the frame of mind of Persians and Greeks. And one of the things he notes is that the problem with the Persians is that they've got a kind of servile mind, a kind of a servile mindset. They don't actually feel like they have the right to exercise their own judgment independently. Whereas with the Greeks, they're always defending their turf. You can't make me do that. But when it comes to an actual battle, what kind of person would you like to have on the front line? A person who's exercising judgment and taking advantage of opportunities that present themselves, or somebody who's just sitting around all day waiting for orders and is afraid of doing something wrong? Well, that's why the Greeks, at least this is my theory, why the Greeks just beat the Persians again and again, even though they're outnumbered, even though, they've got, anyway.
Yeah, there are tactical issues involved too. But actually, I got to tell you this story. I was at a thing called the European Leadership Forum in Poland back in 2013, and I was doing lectures on the Reformation. And it was organized by a friend of mine, Greg Pritchard. I went to Trinity with Greg. And it started off, I was going to do just a small number of these, and he kept adding more and more and more stuff on the schedule. And I was sitting at breakfast, and Os Guinness walked in, and he asked if he could join me. And of course, I'm always happy to spend time with Os. So he sits down and he says, "So, what has Greg got you doing?" And I said, "Well, it was supposed to be just a couple of talks on the Reformation, but it just sort of kept expanding." And I showed him my schedule, and he looked it over and he said to me, Glenn, Alexander the Great said of the Persians that they would always be slaves because they didn't know how to say no.
There you go.
Os is always a gentleman, and I consider it a mark of honor that he slapped me down. Os Guinness is that's.
But that gets me to my point.
That's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, John MacArthur is saying no.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I don't care how you justify this. No,
Yeah.
you are violating the Constitution. Now, taking it to court, letting the judges judge. But I think in the court of evangelical public opinion, John MacArthur has been deemed a heretic because he stood up for boundaries and the recognition of boundaries and the honoring of boundaries. And what kind of situation are we setting ourselves up for with that?
All right, I want you to think about this. Economic systems, just like I talked about, political systems and governments, state and church governments tend to parallel each other. Okay. It's also true of economic systems. Your economic system and your political system go together because both of them are based on common assumptions about human nature and natural human relations. So feudalism is always going to be accompanied by something like manorialism. There's a whole bunch of common assumptions between the two of them. Republican governments, especially democratic Republican governments, real ones as opposed to the old communist ones, are going to always be accompanied by free markets. Because in both cases, it's based on the assumption that you have the right to vote with your ballot or with your dollars. You have the freedom to choose who you want to represent you. You have the freedom to choose what products you want to buy and who you want to buy them from. You have the freedom to decide whose political arguments you want to buy. Okay, those two things go together. So what goes with socialism? Socialism is based on the premise that we can have experts to control the economy. And if we have the experts controlling the economy and the government, then that's going to result in that's going to give us the best results. As a result, socialism inevitably leads to technocracy. So, what's going on in our government? I don't know how many times I've seen believe the science or believe the experts or something like that. We are heading toward technocracy, and we are doing it right at the point where there's also a strong leftward movement in other areas as well.
Yeah, I think that's an observation that I think is impossible to deny, and we find ourselves too, when we think about judgments that are informed by at least an attempt at being fair. An attempt at doing what's right. We can criticize those judgments if they prove to be in error. I don't hear much in the way of correction when it comes to any mea culpa, when it comes to the experts. It's more or less quickly forgotten that maybe the mathematical model was completely crazy. It was informed by all the wrong assumptions. It's more or less, we just kind of move on to the next day and the next subject, and we hand it over to the experts again to tell us what to do.
Well, I also think the experts, they're functioning with this kind of, like I said, I think a very contradictory kind of symbolic stature to begin with. Because on the one hand, we revert to them when it's convenient, and yet it's easy to undermine them when it's not. I think this is some of the hangover, the Enlightenment, lionizing the scientism, and giving that such a high emphasis in terms of cultural authority. And then you also see the reactions to it when it goes, across the grain of other trends. But what you have here is you have, on the one hand, this kind of this rhetorical use of the expert to achieve certain political agendas. And then on the other hand, you see it being undermined to achieve certain political agendas. And one has to begin to ask then, well, maybe take a couple steps back. Why is it that some ethic has the capacity, whether it be the preservation of human beings at all costs, even undermining everything else about human life and flourishing. Or whether it is, the issue we start to see with, some of these radical movements where kind of immediate justice, the immediate justice for this, almost a perfect realization of immediate justice can override a whole system of government and laws and every other aspect. I mean, what you have with the Constitution is, freedom of religion. There is a place for that. We can appeal to that, but all of a sudden that has to take a back seat to the centrality of this particular ethic. And so, this is one of the things I think Alison McIntyre was kind of getting into when he talked about we've lost in the modern world the kind of institutions to actually address these issues. And so what happens is they start to get abstracted from their background context, if you will, their theological or their philosophical roots, and then they become something that starts to dominate the cultural situation. And so nobody knows how to address them. I mean, look at people. They don't know how. You have churches bowing down to ideologies. You have churches submitting to the experts. And so it's like these kinds of groups have been so cultivated in our minds that we're willing to give up everything else of significance just to put them forward. And see, this isn't what I think classical theology did. This isn't what Calvin did. This isn't what the rest of them did. I mean, the first commandment doesn't go away, whether it's your life, your health, or whether it's an issue of ethical, the violation of a certain ethical order. Those aren't first. And I think MacArthur's just coming to this. So yes, the political space he has to work with is his, like you said, his appeal to what he has immediately before him to address it legally and politically. But I think he's acting the right way on his commitment to the commands and the commandments.
Yeah, and I think that's something that the marketers of evangelicalism have thrown out the window. Yeah. Largely because it doesn't play well to the crowd. Principles don't play well to the crowd, and we got to get past that. I think that this brings me back to the example or the story that Glenn told about Calvin. It wasn't the sort of thing that we're told leads to conversion that brought about Calvin's conversion. It was, in fact, realizing that there was something wrong ethically that was occurring that brought about the conversion that Glenn described, if I'm interpreting it correctly. So I think that we just got to stop putting our finger to the wind and trying to figure out which way it's blowing. I think we say what we believe and just say it, and just say, if you don't like it, fine. We're going to continue to do this.
All right. Now here's where this leads. And this is what I think we really are going to need to come to grips with sooner or later. At best, what Trump is doing is slowing the descent. He's not reversing it. The cultural trends, barring the intervention of God, the cultural trends are too well established, and at best, we're buying some time. The question we need to be asking is things like, when the government tells us that, all right, so the Supreme Court. In the Bob Jones decision, Bob Jones University did not allow interracial dating. The Supreme Court ruled that they lose their tax-exempt status because, even though that's a sincerely held religious belief, it went against prevailing public policy or something like that. I forgot the phrase used. That precedent means that whenever there is a widespread cultural mandate, if I can use that word, something, religious freedom takes a back seat.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen when the government says, if you don't perform same-sex marriage, you lose your tax-exempt status?
Yep.
What's going to happen when the government says, if you do not fully affirm and support transgenderism, you lose your tax-exempt status? What's going to happen when when pedophilia gets normalized, and we're on our way there?
Yeah, right. California is already passing legislation. Actually, it's on the desk right now.
Yeah. So what's going to happen in the churches when they've got to decide whether or not they're going to hold? It's always about sex, you'll notice. But what's going to happen when the church has to decide whether or not they are going to uphold traditional Christian morality and lose their tax-exempt status, or maintain their tax-exempt status and compromise?
Yep.
What are they going to do? That's the question we need to be thinking about.
Right. And I think that many people want to keep the can kind of kicked down the road a little farther. You know, they don't want to think about this latest episode as somehow precipitating anything else. They'd like to say this is just about this particular virus and the challenges that we faced in combating it. But I think the camel's nose is in the tent. And the argument that you made, Glenn, concerning tax exemption, I think is a sound one, or a good one. I've heard that one before, but I think where we may also see this occur is this the notion that health and public welfare are somehow easy to define. They're expansive, and I could easily envision or imagine, some kind of campaign trying to avert the suicide of homosexuals, and that the health of the homosexual community is depends upon the universal acceptance of homosexuality, and not just its acceptance, but its sort of adulation.
Yeah, well, actually, we've already passed that point. You need to think about that in terms of transgender.
Yeah. I'm just thinking particularly with relationship to the church, in terms of we've already seen the First Amendment suspended for the sake of public health. No, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship is suspended. I can see that it's not hard to envision, under the right conditions in the right place, that pastors are not allowed to, or churches are not allowed to, discipline people for homosexual behavior or condemn them for homosexual acts. It's already happening in Europe. There are places in Europe where state churches,
or Canada.
Yeah. You are in deep trouble if you get into that subject.
Yeah, you'll be fired if you're associated with those things. Outside of the church, you will. You'll be. I mean, and the violent mob at some point will come and try to probably eliminate you. It's coming. Yeah. And I think another thread is that it's something that is very pressing. Is that we're on the verge because of the kind of multicultural postmodern shape to all this, to new tribalisms, which inevitably are starting to move into tribalistic wars within the city. You're seeing it. I mean, you saw it in Portland with the murder of someone recently, and the church is inevitably at some point going to be caught up in the mix, because they're going to be associated with people, whether or not the church wants to be associated with people or not. And so the big ethical issues churches have always had to, where do we draw the lines? Where do we fight? Where do we not fight? Where is it? It's martyrdom. Where is it? To actually, rid the context, rid the context of its idols. I mean, these things are things that have always been there for covenant people, because there's a continuity for us. And, as Ecclesiastes, like you said, teaches us, there is a time for all of it, but we're going to have to draw off of our resources to know how to deal with it Christianly and with wisdom. And I think, like Glenn's talking about, that's one episode of it. I mean, similarly, you know, for all his faults, Karl Barth dealt with this with Nazism in Germany and the way it took over, and, you know, who capitulated very quickly? Well, you know, the state churches, but evangelicals did. And Karl Barth, who was not a huge fan of, you know, he was someone who was always talking about the newness of Christ. So he didn't really put all this deep stock in the confessional tradition. All of a sudden found himself writing a Barmen Declaration, a confession, and had to reevaluate his whole theology. And it basically is, what does it mean to be faithful to Christ as Lord in this context in which all the churches are abandoning that ultimate commitment? And so it was, you know, this continuous return to Christ's lordship in these contexts is something that, I mean, maybe we didn't expect it to roll over onto us here in our country, but it's here.
Yeah, it is. I was talking with Doug about the people who are coming their way, and the people, as we noted, are well educated. And people who have professional stature, but they're afraid. And everywhere I go, people are afraid. I'm a board member of an academic association, and every person in that association is afraid of being canceled, and I mean permanently from their jobs at the university or college in which they teach. Because they can see that there are statements that are circulating in those places, and many of them are doing this very thing. They're counting the cost. Can I sign this? How can I sign this?
Yeah.
Is there some way I can justify signing this? And when they don't, they know they've got a black mark.
Yeah.
They know that they now stand out in the eyes of their colleagues.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. Well,
and it's in the church as well. That's about all I wanted to say, is that even in presbyteries and in denominations, this sort of thing's going on.
And I do think this is a radical, you know, this is a time we've, you know, the three of us actually started this out kind of with the early impulses of the direction of things. And then we've thought very long and hard. I mean, we know at some point all of us are going to be a situation like that, one way or the other. And this is a time, I think, for evangelicals and or any Christian for that matter, who's concerned about fidelity to our God and the riches of our faith, is that the money has to start to match, you know, where people need to put the investment into educational institutions and alternatives, because all these people are going to be refugees soon, and we have a rich amount of tradition, reflection, and people who can really lead things in a different direction than the degradation and the dismantling that's going on the outside. Look, as Chris says often, it's easy for these people who've never built anything to destroy things. But we are the people that build things, and this is where we need to be investing. You know, we do it with our children already, you know, classical schools, different kinds of education. But I think from the seminary level and the academic level and the pastoral level, I think that it's a time for the church to really reinvest itself in alternatives that have the capacity. I mean, look what Calvin did in Geneva. You know, he's already started a mission society. He already started continuously teaching. He already developed all these alternatives. And that is, I think, one of the other ways. You know, I often think of, you know, you hear the story of when the Orthodox are run out of Turkey and other places, you know, Constantinople. And they ran with their libraries. I mean, that always tells me something significant. You know, we don't leave our riches behind, but we take them and then we invest in them. And this is the time.
Yeah, that's right. Classic example of that from my period in the Renaissance is Bessarion, who is one of the key figures that transmits Greek learning into the Italian Renaissance and brings his library with him. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, something else that, you know, I know we're running short on time, but there's one other idea I wanted to throw out here. Well, two. One of them real quickly. there can be negative consequences to this kind of refugee situation. So, for example, in Geneva, so many French refugees poured in that the language of the city changed. The natives spoke Savoyard, which was a sort of cross between Italian and French. Given the geography, not surprising. It turned into a French-speaking city.
Huh.
And the natives weren't happy about that.
Right, right.
But the other side of this, though, that I think is worth considering has to do ultimately with Rod Dreher's Benedict option. Now, I don't like the name Benedict option, but he is on to something. Every major reform movement in church history started either in a monastery or in another form of intentional community. And the reason for that, I'm convinced, is because values are formed in community. And if you don't have an intentional Christian community, the values are going to be formed by society. And the church always goes wrong. Every time it gets corrupt because it's adopting social values. So what you need is a situation where you can create an alternative community in which we can pass down values, education, knowledge, all of these kinds of things to the next generation. And then from there, they maybe can go out and resalt these things into the broader society.
Yeah. Yeah, there's
to some extent, that's what Doug's doing.
Oh, definitely. In fact, the latest issue of The Masculinists, our friend Aaron Wren, he reflected upon his experiences in Moscow. And one of the things that, I know Rod and I know Doug. And one of the weird and sad things has been sort of their knocking heads with each other. Now, of the two, I'm closer to Doug, and I like Doug more than Rod. I'll admit it. But Rod's a decent guy, and I can't help but sort of, I guess, in some measure, lament the fact that Rod was unable to see what was really kind of going on the ground in Moscow. Now, I don't know if he's ever been there. Probably not. But anybody who has been there, can see a lot of healthy things going on. And you spoke a minute ago about resentment, sort of the natives. Well, the community there in Moscow of these refugee Christians, reformed people coming to Moscow and buying houses is shooting up property values. So they're happy in that sense, but they're also noticing that this Christian community is getting bigger and bigger and more influential, and is starting to make a mark in politics. And so it's a very fascinating kind of thing going on there in Moscow. And I think that we need more Moscows. I don't think that it's, something that's sort of one and done. But at the same time, I'll admit, I've been looking into real estate in Moscow. You got to have someplace to go if it really gets bad.
Especially with some range. There's good range there.
Yeah, right, yeah. Anyway,
all my Southern family are laughing right now on that comment.
So I guess we should probably wrap up here. Is there anything that you wanted to say, Tom, as we conclude?
No, this is a great topic, and it leads into a lot of complementary topics, and I think it's worth revisiting. There are a lot of pressing issues that oftentimes we don't wish we had to attend to, but they're here, and we have to take the wisdom that we've gained and look to the wisdom of the past to kind of direct us. And one last point, I think Dreher's dug very deep in the well of Alistair McIntyre, who was thinking about these things, a long time ago, and it's kind of interesting to see them come to full fruition.
Early 80s.
Yes, that's right. And Hauerwas kind of did it, communities of character. He had his own flavor to it and his own kind of personality in it. But they were seeing something that is on our lap, and Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating too, because many people would consider the early '80s sort of like a Renaissance time for evangelical sort of, sort of influence.
Yeah.
You know, not just through the moral majority and all that kind of stuff, but just in terms of getting on the radar with places like, Time Magazine and so forth.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Glenn, anything you want to say as we wrap up?
Yeah, I suppose the thing that we really need to consider, and it might be worth talking about at some point together, is we need to be clear on what we stand for, what we can. There are places where we can compromise. Not everything is absolute.
Sure.
But where are those absolute lines drawn? What are the things that are the non-negotiables? We need to be really clear on that. And we also need to be clear, I think, on where we draw the line between stand and fight or flee to the next city because you won't go through all the cities of Israel before I return.
Right, right.
We have to figure out where these lines are. And I don't know that anybody is really spending a lot of time or effort trying to sort that out, and particularly the refugee side of it.
Right, right. You wanted to say something, Tom?
Well, I was thinking maybe next week what I'll do, because it applies to your first question, but I'll talk about Barmen Declaration, and maybe we can kind of pivot, because that's sort of what the question they were asking. Where do we draw the line as Christians at this point? And what are the core kind of, there was a list of things that Christians would not compromise on. And there, you just stand up for, whether it's martyrdom or defense, and that's it. So maybe I'll pick up that theme next week.
Well, that'd be great. That'd be great. Anyway, we should wrap things up. I wanted to say a couple of things before we do, though. For those of you who listen and have pledged to our Indiegogo campaign, you've probably been wondering, where is my glass? Where is my T-shirt? Well, they're going out in the mail, I want you to know. We were waiting on the T-shirts. We had an issue with one of the T-shirt companies. We had to find another one. Anyway, that's all worked out. And so the T-shirts have been printed, and we're going to be sending those out. They may already be in the mail. So by the time you actually hear this podcast, you may have yours there at your house. Anyway, just so you know, we haven't gotten our T-shirts and glasses yet either. So, but they're on their way. And then the other thing, of course, is the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network down in Nashville, October 1st through the 3rd. It's going to be a lot of fun. Our man, Glenn Sunshine, is one of the speakers. Doug, who we've referred to or talked about a couple of times during this podcast, is going to be there, Doug Wilson. And there are other speakers. I believe David Bonson's going to be there. So that should be great. Yeah. So anyway, that's it for now. We've already gone on a little longer than we should. So thanks a lot for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye now.